Hey, GP learners. I know many of you are trainees and potentially trainers out there that are working in primary care, and there's been a couple of changes that have happened. In the past few weeks, we've had new information as to what general practice training is going to look like, and particularly changes in the types of assessments that we have to deal with. And in order to help kind of demystify this, I thought we'd better speak to somebody who knows a hell of a lot more about it than I do. And I'm honoured to be joined by Dr. Jamie Green, who's an Associate Dean at Health Education East Midlands, or HEEM as I like to call it. And he's going to hopefully share with us the changes that have happened to general practice training. It's tech enhance your primary care and learning. And welcome to Dr. Jamie Green. How are we doing?
Yeah, good morning.
Thank you. So this is the second time Janie's joining us. And if you haven't checked out our previous episode that looks at things like the ARCP panels and stuff, feel free to do so. But Jamie, I'm a little bit confused. There's been some significant changes, I guess, particularly to what training looks like. And I'd really like it if you could help us understand what on earth has happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the background, while the world has been turning upside down, actually there's been a long plan to redevelop workplace-based assessment within GP training. This has also coincided with the 14 FISH portfolio, and so from now, August 2020, we are working towards getting all of the all areas onto the new 14 FISH platform. And what we have is a whole new program of workplace-based assessment that will look and feel slightly different in different areas. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, it's just really about the numbers and plus a couple of extra new assessments that have now come into the program.
Okay, so if we take this from the years, if that's all right. So for ST1s that have just joined the scheme, obviously many of them won't know any different. Has there been any significant changes for the ST1s?
So for ST1s, there's a change in the numbers that are around, and certainly I would recommend that any new ST1s look on the Royal College website at the assessments required. The first thing is, if you look at the old mini KECs and COTS assessments, those have now been moved to, rather than doing 6 throughout the year, you need to do 4. So okay. There's a reduction in the numbers. The same with the case-based discussion, or well, it's only case-based discussions in ST1, so they are looking the same. Mm-hmm. MSFs, you need to do 1 in ST1 and 1 in ST2. So it used to be trying to do 2 in ST1. So that's a slight change. Mm-hmm. Clinical supervisors reports remain the same. Patient satisfaction questionnaires, while in GP, you don't need to do that now in ST1 or 2. So that's been moved. SEPs remain the same. We've still got the 5 intimate examinations that are mandated by the GMC, and they will stay. But I always recommend that anybody try to do SEPs assessments across multiple different systems, because it helps fill in that capability area for clinical assessment and procedural skills. Learning logs have changed, and this is probably the biggest change you'll see. Rather than having to do multiple learning logs across a broad range of different topics, we're now asking that you do 36 case reviews. These are very much patient-facing reflections upon things that you've experienced. So that's changed, and the fact that there's now a mandated number allows trainees to, I think, to plan their time a bit better around what cases they want to review and talk about in their portfolio. So
if I'm right then, over a standard kind of training period of, say, for example, 12 months, that would mean 3 case reviews in total per month. Can you give us any idea of what, a case review should kind of incorporate, or what trainees need to think about when they're doing the case reviews?
Case reviews are different to learning logs, because you're not selecting from a broad range of different items to put in there. You're reflecting on individual cases, and so it's a push towards more clinical cases. Now, I've not seen what the case reviews look like on the new portfolio yet, but that will be released in the next couple of days, and so I'll be jumping into there straight away to have a close look at them.
Okay, cool. So case reviews are probably the biggest change for ST1s. Anything else that they just need to be aware of, or?
Yeah, so one of the things that's now added into the portfolio is a placement planning meeting. So previously we used to leave maybe an educator's note, or the trainee would put a professional conversation into the learning logs around how you've planned your placement. But now there's a formal form on the portfolio to how to plan your placement, which I think is always useful.
I guess it offers a bit more structure to that kind of discussion that many of us probably have had with our trainees. It's useful.
It. Absolutely. There's also a recommendation that in ST1 you focus on doing a quality improvement project. Okay, and so there'll be a standard set of paperwork on how to do that within the portfolio. There'll be the evidence required for the quick workplace-based assessment. And again, the best place to work out how to plan that in ST1 would be to look onto the Royal College of GP's website.
Okay, so that's the ST1s. Anything different for the ST2s?
So with the ST2s, very much the same as ST1. The only real difference is if you've not done the QIP in ST1, you do that in ST2. You still want your placement planning meetings. The only other thing that probably we should mention for ST1s and ST2s is the interim ESR. So the way things used to be is you'd have 6 monthly educational supervisor reports, which were quite intensive. And as a trainer, I can certainly vouch for the fact that a lot of planning goes into them.
Yep.
What we're doing now is an annual ESR along with an interim ESR, which is a very much light touch at the midpoint of the year. So that should reduce the burden on trainers and trainees to provide evidence at that time. That doesn't mean that you can't then be struggling at that interim ESR, and that would require you to go to an ARCP panel. But it does mean that actually in the middle of your year, you're not having to produce a whole load of additional paperwork, which is quite onerous, I think.
Yeah. And I guess that being lighter touch is definitely appreciated, particularly when you've got multiple trainees and trying to fit that in a January time frame. That was painful,
especially when the trainees aren't around you. If they're off in secondary care, as much as we try and keep on top of their portfolios, quite often they're enjoying themselves too much for us to really keep in touch with them.
Yep. Okay. So ST1s and ST2s, fairly minor changes. I don't think that's the case for our ST3s, is that?
No. ST3s, as you probably saw last year, there were things like the prescribing review that was coming in and was being piloted. Well, that's definitely coming in now. We know that ST3s will have to do the prescribing assessment. We know that they will have to do a learning event analysis, which is kind of like a significant event analysis. And in fact, you need to do one of those every ST year. That's one thing I forgot before to mention.
Okay.
Quality improvement project, you don't have to do in an ST3 anymore. So that's moved to earlier in training. But what has changed is you're doing less COTS, so only 7. And we're changing case-based discussions to CATs, C-A-Ts, which is a, I'm trying to remember what it stands for. It's a consultation assessment tool. So it's a slightly newer version of the case-based discussion. But it can also include things like a random case review, leadership activities, prescribing assessment follow-up. So there's new formats within there that can be used for that time. Okay. The MSF is also changing. Previously, you would have done 2 MSFs in ST3. Now you're doing 1 standard MSF across 10 raters, and you're now doing 1 leadership MSF, which will be much more focused upon how you demonstrated your leadership competencies and capabilities.
So that seems to me quite an interesting one, because I can definitely hear the voices of several trainees saying, how on earth can I show what I've done in leadership in my ST3 year? I think that's going to cause some confusion. Have you got any tips for us on that particular one?
I think one of the key things that we know is that the GMC are really hot on leadership. It's been, to be honest, when I was an FY2, it was this advent of Darcy Fellows, and I remember that was the big thing back then. And I worked as a leadership fellow myself, and it was quite a nebulous idea at that point. And since then, we've had sort of enforced leadership training as we go along. This is the first time, to my knowledge, that we've actually assessed that in a primary care environment. And in ST3, what we're really trying to do is provide sort of feedback on how you've performed from within the leadership type capabilities in the portfolio. And there's actually a leadership workplace-based assessment manual now on the Royal College website, which is really worth looking into. And it goes through all of the activities and how to approach the leadership workplace-based assessment. So the key things about how you lead yourself, how organized you are in yourself, how you lead the team and how you focus on working with the team, how you work with the system and how you understand and recognize the system around you, and also how you fitted in with your team. So certainly what it's doing really is separating out clinical capacity and leadership capacity, because, you know, a big part of being a GP is actually running a surgery, running a team. And, you know, as much as a GP trainee might turn around and say, well, all I want to do is be an out-of-hours doctor or a salaried doctor, or I want to work in education, which, you know, who would want to do that? But in reality, all of those things require you to do a degree of leadership and to be able to maintain, you know, a fairly good standard of care, which I think that's what we're trying to filter out. It's not just about knowing your stuff. It's about doing the job and doing it in a way that you can improve things and improve people around you.
And do you think some of that lends into this whole trajectory we've got in general practice and primary care about obviously additional roles and supervision that's going to come into play of those additional roles? I mean, clearly with my hat as a PCN director, that's something that's coming in significant force, particularly over the next 2 years, to everywhere rather than just being in focal points. Do you think that's trying to lend into some of that?
I'm not sure why it was done. I wasn't around the table when that was being decided, but I think what's really clear is that in the last year, as you said, if you're a PCN director, we've suddenly developed a huge new swathe of leadership, of new leaders within the NHS and within general practice. And certainly, you know, so much of our time now has been taken away from clinical care to do things like that, which I do think does have positive impacts on services if it's done right. But in reality, when a GP trainee leaves training, they need to be able to work in all of the areas that GPs do work. And that means that to have the capacity to work in a leadership capacity as a PCN director, or to work as a GP in out of hours, or a GP in a single-handed practice, you know, which is why we actually specify that people, for instance, have to do, you know, the mandatory SEPs, for instance. As a male GP, I very rarely see gynecology, but it's so vital that when it does come towards me that I know what I'm doing, and I can feel out of my depth, certainly, as a GP. But it's important that when I leave training, especially, that I'm capable and competent to work in every area that I come across.
Okay. So we talked about obviously some of the newer assessments. I guess one that many people are still questioning is the prescribing assessment, because that was, like you said, it was a pilot last year. It's now become a formal part of the assessment process. Any, I guess, details or hints in terms of how practices or, you know, trainers can approach that? Yeah.
So there's actually a set of reports that are generated via Ardent, I believe. I think they're the ones who actually created the original reports for the prescribing assessment. What it does, it pulls all of your recent prescriptions out. It then gets submitted into a document which can then be interrogated, and you can have a look at each of your prescriptions to work out if there are any errors in there. There's some brilliant evidence behind reviewing your own prescribing practice and improvements in that prescribing practice. And having gone through this with my last ST3, and also looking at it from the perspective of, well, maybe I make all of those mistakes too. I think this is the kind of work that probably a lot of us will be doing. And I will not be surprised if this kind of work doesn't creep its way into appraisal at some point. So I think, just to scare the people out there who hate.
Yeah, that's going to be fun.
I can see the hates being added at the bottom of this.
Never read the comments.
Never read the comments. But essentially, yeah, the prescribing assessment is a brilliant way of assessing how you're prescribing. I think it does change practice. It's a bit complicated to do from the beginning, but there's a step-to-step guide on the Royal College website. You quite often need someone from an admin perspective in your surgery to help you with that. But if you can get it done early, I think it will help you through the whole of ST3.
Okay, so we talked about the COTS, the CBs, or the CATs as they're going to be called. I love the way that training has almost everything beginning with a C. It's like they're obsessed with the letter C, to be honest. We talked about the MSFs and the changes that have happened. PSQs, is there any significant changes, do we think?
So the main change with PSQ is that those are no longer happening within ST1, they're happening at the end. I believe the PSQ forms have changed somewhat, and the way you can actually request PSQs have changed too. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I really like actually is not just the PSQs, but in the MSFs, the way 14 Fish have done it in the portfolio, and I had a demo of this fairly recently, you cannot submit your MSF until you've got the required number of assessors, which for me as an ARCP panel chair is brilliant, because it means I'll have trainees no longer come into panel without the required numbers, with the required 5 clinical and 5 non-clinical assessors, which isn't always clear, because on the previous portfolio you couldn't tell who had responded or which numbers had responded. So yeah, big changes there. I think that would be quite useful.
And I guess one question with the PSQs, obviously we are now in the during COVID phase. The contacts potentially trainees have with face-to-face has considerably changed. How are they going to be able to complete the number of PSQs that are required to do? Because for 40 face-to-face consultations, to be honest, my trainees, with the way we're currently working, they're talking at least about 8 weeks or so that's going to have to take for them to even get that level of completed forms.
Yeah, I think that's a real difficult situation. I don't know what's happening on the new portfolio to address that, whether you can send forms out directly to patients. I suspect if that functionality isn't in there at the moment, it will be very soon. And even if it's not, you could probably send a form out to a patient on Accurix and get them to send it back to you. I'm sure there are ways you could actually make that form work on remote consultations, because like me, most trainees will be doing a predominant amount of their time now as a remote consultation.
Yeah, and particularly online consultations. I mean, this is the one part I think the training hasn't potentially caught up with, but we are going to see obviously more and more trainees and GPs move towards doing online consultations. So I wonder how, that's a question again for people well above our pay grade, but how that's going to manifest in terms of training and assessment that's going to happen over time, whether that's the CBD, the CATS kind of thing, or something else. But it'll be interesting to see how that changes. Because obviously telephone consultation is already part of the assessments.
Yeah.
And they're part of the RCA, which I guess was the other thing I wanted to talk about, this lovely new assessment that we're all having to incorporate into the world. I mean, I know it scares a lot of people. What are your thoughts with the RCA?
The RCA is an interesting assessment. It was made at great pace, and I think the IT platform to do it on was made incredibly quickly, and to be honest, incredibly well. I think it works well. It looks good. And at the end of my last ST3's training, probably the best training we provided to her was when we were reviewing her video assessments for the RCA. There are other IT platforms out there that do similar things. Is it Iris Connect, or I Connect, or something like that?
Yep, Iris Connect.
Yeah, so there's a few companies out there that I know I've spoken to before about doing similar things to, but 14 Fish have integrated it into the portfolio, and with any luck, hopefully, I think you mentioned about catching up with online consulting. I suspect that will be the next step, that this will become part of the portfolio, and we'll have assessments on there, videoed, reviewed, commented upon outside of the RCA, because I can't see how you can't do that over the long term. But certainly at the moment, I think the RCA works well for trainees. It's not perfect, and at the moment the GMC have said, because it's similar to the CSA, they're letting it go through. But there's loads of challenges with marking an RCA around how people have selected cases. What do you do if a doctor starts opening up Google to look at the answers? That's actually part of real practice. It's what we do, but how is that actually assessed? because we're still using the CSA mark schemes. So there's loads of questions that we haven't answered about the RCA. What I can say is it will be with us for some considerable time, probably a year, maybe two. And when we return from the RCA to something like the CSA, it may end up being a hybrid-based system whereby you do some RCA-based consultations and you do some CSA standardized cases. It may also be that there are standardized cases which are videotaped remotely. So that's also a possibility that's been discussed as well.
Definitely. And I think there is the option of delivering that kind of assessment, like you say, through a remote mechanism, purely and simply because of the environmental impact it potentially has in terms of not having to drag so many people down to a central place in London, and trains and planes and all the lovely stuff that come with it, and particularly with the RCGP stance on sustainability and our pending climate crisis and stuff. So yeah, is that something we need to be aware of? Thankfully, it's people well above our pay grade to even consider those decisions. So yes. But yeah, I guess the RCA, obviously, we know that for the next few months, there's many trainees in a state of flux that have either had their training paused or having to go through the process fairly quickly to make sure that they hit their end times and stuff. I guess from about, January time, we're going to hit most trainees back into normal training process. One key thing I would love to know is what it does mean for for a trainee that fails the RCA. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but clearly that's a reality we may have to deal with. And does that mean that they have to do the whole load of recordings again, or can they use some of the ones previously or not? Don't know. I guess that's a question that'd be useful to have an answer for. But I mean, in the next few months, what would you say are the key things that trainers and trainees really just need to look at, deal with, just to get their heads round it and figure out what they need to do for the next 6 months to a year with training?
I think so for instance, there's a few things that probably need to start working again. Out of hours is one area. I was in a meeting yesterday with a huge out of hours provider about how we're going to get trainees working in an out of hours setting safely. And that hopefully will happen in September time. So that's one key bit about urgent and scheduled care. How we deliver things. I mean, I think all of the challenges that face primary care at the moment also face training and mean that training is so much more difficult. This week we've been running our induction program, but how do you realistically have a brand new ST1 sitting into consultations? I mean, are we doing that remotely? Are we having them in the room? Is that a safe way to work? And I think different people will come with different answers to that. But certainly, I don't feel safe with someone sitting in a room with me and necessarily maintaining social distancing. But at the same time, it has to happen. How do we show a new group of GPs what primary care is all about when actually primary care doesn't know what it's about anymore because of the way things are changing? So I think you hit the nail on the head earlier when you said really training hasn't caught up with online consulting. A lot of the skills are the same, the diseases are the same. Okay, some of the diseases are a bit different, and the post-COVID syndromes and things like that will be, interesting and challenging. But ultimately, I think we're probably facing all of these troubles together. And I think as long as we try to let our trainees experience everything we're experiencing, I think we should be in a situation to get them the kind of training they need. One of the big problems with training is where if we ever perceive a trainee is struggling, we often don't give them the opportunity to see the more complex patients. And that's the prime example I always give is a trainee who you think is struggling in the surgery. You probably aren't going to send them on a home visit to a palliative care patient. And that's probably the kind of ones we want to keep to ourselves, but they still need to see palliative care. And so there's a problem with trainees who are perceived to have struggles in care and giving them all of the experiences they need, and you're kind of doubling the problem if you don't let them see the more complex stuff.
Interesting point to make, and definitely one I think that is valid. And like you say, it's giving them the right exposure within their abilities, but also being able, I guess, to push them a little bit as well, because otherwise you don't want them getting to the end point and not being able to cross the finish line, because that's just doesn't help anybody overall, does it?
Okay.
Cool. Thank you for that, Jamie. And again, if anybody wants to check out our earlier episode that talks a little bit more about the whole competencies and particularly the ARCP panels, feel free to check that out. You should be seeing that coming up right back here. And if not, it'll be down in the show notes. I'm sure YouTube's selecting some other kind of video for you to have a look around about here and stuff. And thank you, Jamie, for your time. I've really appreciated it. And in terms of anybody else, if you've got any comments or questions, feel free to contact whichever platform you prefer. And as always, make sure you subscribe, click the bell. And as always, EGP Learning is here to help save you and your patients time by tech enhancing your primary care and learning. We'll catch you in the next episode.